Another month, another digest, where I rank all the movies, TV shows, games, and any other type of media that I finished last month, as well as announcing the randomly selected things I'll be watching next month, as suggested by you guys at EliteAri.com. This month was an interesting mix, a few rewatches, a movie that I actually watched in the cinemas, a continuing TV series, 2 new anime, the most controversial Star Wars TV show of all time, and my first Tarantino movie. First, let's get the rewatches out of the way. We have Madoka Magica and its sequel movie Rebellion, and it was my 3rd time watching both of them. Madoka is an anime about a girl who's given the opportunity to make any wish she wants in exchange for becoming a magical girl. I really liked the series during my first and second watch-throughs over the years, and this latest watch-through elevated my appreciation even more. In particular, the characters, even the relatively minor ones, were far more interesting than I remembered, and the story itself explored some interesting themes concerning identity, purpose, and selfishness. The aesthetic of the show, and especially the movie, remained the highlight, with a bunch of gorgeous, ominous-looking silhouette shots, and the eclectic art style of The Witch's Labyrinths being an absolute visual feast. And hence, the series is getting a 4 out of 5, while the Rebellion movie is an easy 5. Next up, I beat Terraria by myself for the first time. If you somehow haven't heard about it, it's a 2D RPG sandbox where you can mine the environment, build structures, and craft things like weapons and armor. I had a great time sinking 130 hours into beating it. I started off trying to play as a summoner, but slowly realized that with my sloppy skills and evading attacks, I had no hope of getting anywhere near beating the game without being a complete tank. So that's what I became. As I usually do with most sandbox games, I had the most fun building things, like my little teleporter room in the middle of nowhere and my giant Plantera farm. But I don't have too much to say beyond that. Terraria is one of my favorite games of all time, and it was very satisfying to beat it solo for the first time. An easy 5 out of 5. So now let's talk about this month's TV shows. First up, we have The Acolyte, a live-action Star Wars TV series taking place in the High Republic, an era where the Jedi are at their height. This show started out as a breath of fresh air in the live-action Star Wars media landscape. It had a large cast of new characters in new locations in a new era, introduced fascinating new concepts to the canon, had live-action fights infinitely more interesting than any since the prequel era. It was unequivocally refreshing and overwhelmingly a clumsy, tedious disappointment. It was poorly paced, had a variety of small plot botherances, especially in the latter half of the show. It had some decently poor acting or directing, depending on who you blame, but all of this is nothing compared to the bland answers it gave to the big mystery that was built up far too much across the entire show. The Acolyte wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen, but it certainly wasn't great, and so I'm giving it a 2 out of 5. Then we have The Boys Season 4, a gritty satirical superhero show which I've thoroughly enjoyed over the years. This season started out pretty strong, was a little weak in the middle, but ended up finishing strong again. It introduced 2 new big characters in Sage and Firecracker, and they were both great additions to the cast. Of the many storylines, Homelanders and Hueys were definitely the best, followed by A-Trains, Butchers, and the Deeps. On the complete other end, we have Starlight, who was a little frustrating this season, and Frenchie, whose storyline was easily the worst of the entire show so far, one of the most boring things I've seen in my life. But putting the story aside, the visual effects were top-notch as always, and I generally really looked forward to watching this week to week. Overall, Season 4 is aptly getting a 4 out of 5. Next up, we have Gunbuster, a series of anime OVAs that came out in 1988 and 89, directed by Evangelion's Hideaki Anno. This is a sci-fi drama following a group of girls and their dramatic lives on Earth and in space. Now inherently, I have a revulsion for old media. It's slow-paced, it's ugly, and just generally not my thing. But I really have no good reason to think this, it's just a weird falsehood that's implanted itself in my mind. Gunbuster is the prime example proving this conception wrong. Firstly, it's beautiful, with very detailed art in the foreground and background, and presents a world that just feels alive. And secondly, it's perfectly paced, with a really interesting story that has a really interesting ending, and tackles the idea of time passing by in a really interesting manner. I'm glad I was convinced to watch Gunbuster, and it turns out that I really love it, and I'm giving it a 5 out of 5. Another anime I watched this month was Ascendance of a Bookworm, which has a whole 36 episodes, making it the longest new anime I've seen since Dr. Stone back at the beginning of 2023. Ascendance of a Bookworm is an adaptation of a light novel series following Urano and how her love for books shapes her life when she is born into a new fantasy world as a little girl called Mine. The appeal of this anime ended up being the cute, wholesome moments surrounding a fun cast of characters. It's a joy watching Mine and Benno argue about the price of Mine's newest invention, or watching the kids happily marching to their baptism with the whole small town cheering and waving for them. However, there is a major drawback, which is the show's absolutely mediocre production value. There's quite a lot of still frames, bland storyboarding and directing, and a world that generally feels mostly empty. And this brings my overall enjoyment down quite a lot. Now, I do know that a lot of people regard this series as one of the best light novels of all time, but the anime certainly doesn't give me any sense of depth or much general intrigue, and it makes me quite curious to read the light novel just to see what people are talking about, and I probably eventually will. But as it currently stands, Ascendance of a Bookworm is getting a 3 out of 5. Finally, we've got the 2 movies I watched. The first I watched with my friends in the cinemas, Deadpool and Wolverine, the latest installment of the MCU and the third Deadpool movie. Deadpool 1 had the action, Deadpool 2 had the emotions, and Deadpool 3 has the multiverse cameos. And the majority of the appeal of this movie starts and stops there. The cameos are fun, but beyond that, the movie feels like it's loosely tied together by quite a weak plot, with a bunch of fight scenes that feel mostly empty to me, with comedy that sometimes lands well, but doesn't really do it for me. It's certainly not a boring movie, and it's certainly not completely devoid of interesting and even genuine serious moments, but sadly, I didn't really enjoy it all too much. And besides the fantastic opening dance scene, I don't think I'll ever watch this movie again. And so it's getting a 2 out of 5. Finally, we've got Jackie Brown, my first Tarantino movie, somewhat of a crime drama about a flight attendant and a gun trafficker played by Samuel L. Jackson. And I'll be honest, I have very little to say about this movie. It was a decent, typical movie that I generally enjoyed watching, with nothing that really stood out as special to me. The movie does a good job building to its climax, which is both suspenseful, somewhat thrilling, and a little bit funny. Beyond that, what can I say? It's almost the definition of a 3 out of 5. A good, decent movie, but without anything particularly great. And that's this month's digest, one of the more eventful months this year. If you're interested in more in-depth discussions for these particular pieces of media, check the links in the description for their individual videos. As for next month, I spun Selection Wheel last stream on the Elite Ari channel to choose from some of your suggestions made at EliteAri.com. So make sure you subscribe to Elite Ari and check out the website. The winners for this month are 2 movies, Searching for Sugar Man and The Godfather. See you next month.